colors are beautiful.
Well, yeah, and actually it's good that you pointed that out, because when you think there's kind of 4 pillars to the Métis culture, or the traditional name of the Métis being Michif, right? The Métis flag, right? This was gifted to the Métis Nation in 1814, right, by members of the Northwest Company. And I like blue, right? That's my favorite color. So I kind of side with the French, because when I was growing up, I thought the blue Métis flag, right, the joining of the Indigenous with the European into one new nation that will live forever. That's with the infinity symbol. But the blue is the French influence, the Northwest Company. There's also a red version, which is that affinity or affiliation to the Hudson's Bay Company, right? Because again, right, those hardworking voyageurs, those Métis men worked for both companies. And it's hard to imagine, like here we are, right, north of the Walterdale Bridge, that there's even companies from New York City, the XY Company, that were here and had forts, right? It wasn't just the Hudson's Bay and the Northwest Company. And also this flag, in my opinion, and again with the audience, right, to do their own research, is I believe this should be really promoted as Canada's first patriotic flag, because it was flown into battle in 1816. So when you think when we were a French colony, we had the French flag, and then the Union Jack being a British colony, and then all of that influx and all that change, right? And we have the Métis flag. And then we have, of course, as the world knows us, as the red, white, maple leaf. And when you look at me, our current flag as a proud military member that I wear on my uniform is only 7 years older than I am. A lot of people are blown away that it came out in 1965, right? I was born in 1972, so it's only, when you look at me, our flag is only 7 years older than me. And when you think we had a flag in 1816, when it officially as a nation, because when you fly your flag into battle, right, you can kind of see that launch of a nationhood way back then. So that being that key pillar of the Métis culture, right? And when I bestowed the sash, and you were asking about the colors, it's interesting when you ask the children what the red means, right? They always say love, right? Because when you think Valentine's Day, red is love, the heart. But again, you know, as adults, we understand that there's many black guys of Canadian history, right? Don't get me wrong, Canada is such a beautiful, strong, diverse country, but we really still need to embrace those truths, which are those ugly truths, right? So the bloodshed, right, with Louis Riel, right, when you think on my, proudly wear on my vest, right, he was our leader, right, and now is a martyr for the Métis Nation, right, because he led 2 resistances. One was 1869 that led to the founding of Manitoba. And isn't it sad to think, here we are in 2024, he's still not basically properly revered for what he is, right? The father of Manitoba, he was elected 3 times to Parliament, was in exile in Montana, where some of my relatives convinced him to come back to Saskatchewan, right? Because the Métis, our homeland is the Red River Settlement, which is Winnipeg, Manitoba. But because of all the early the European settlers coming west, we kept getting forced west. So essentially we set up shop in Batoche, where, right, my 4th great-grandfather fought in battle in the Battle of Batoche, and why I wear my sash from Batoche. He led that second resistance, right? And that was, you know, the Battle of Frog Lake, Battle of Duck Lake first, and then Frog Lake, and then Batoche. And then he was hung on November 16, 1885, for fighting for what we as Métis people have always believed to be true, right? Like, you don't own the land, you're a part of the land, just like our First Nations cousins. And for us to be kind of already established with our Red River lots and our families, and to keep getting displaced by these surveyors from the Dominion of Canada, you can imagine when your back's against the wall, you can either take it and be absorbed or fight for what you believe in. And of course, as someone who is a living testament, right, it was worth fighting for. But sadly, from 1885 to 1982, when the Constitution changed, you can imagine that was a long period of time where the Métis were silenced. Because literally, May 13, 1885, all of the First Nation regalia, all of the Métis regalia was literally thrown in the closet, and then everyone going, I'm a settler, give me a job. Do you know what I mean? And for so long, it was all about trying to fit in, to have a bit of a life, right? To have that family and to continue on and do ceremony and, you know, in the the darkness, if you will, in the closet, away from, mainstream society. But when the Constitution changed, that the Métis were not the forgotten people, the right-of-way people, you can see how that kind of revitalized the Métis Nation. And even now, right now, with the Métis Nation of Alberta, along with other nations across the prairies, we're at, I think, after the third reading, to basically have our self-governance given back to us. So you can see last year was a very historic time when we voted in our official constitution for the Métis Nation of Alberta and created 22 districts, because before we had 6 regions. You can see, like, we're seeing history in the making, but for so long, the Métis people were forgotten about, like literally called an apple, red on the outside, white in the inside. You can see it's very derogatory, right? You're not Indian enough and you're not settler enough. So you can see we're getting discrimination from both. And then on top of it, the government saying, well, you don't really exist to us because, you're not like the voting members, right? Because it's just sad, like that legacy piece too with the Indian Act, right? And it's one of those things for what we're talking about on the program today is for people to really dig in, right? It's kind of sad to think like people say Indian and some First Nations prefer that. But look at that legacy from 1492 when Columbus came to the New World and thinking it was in the East Indies, and he thought these were Indians, the Indigenous people, and that legacy that led to the Indian Act and even the modern day foster care system is all of that assimilation to kill the Indian and the child to basically make them one of us. And as we know in today's world, to be very inclusive, we are stronger together, and all of our difference, especially in the corporate world, people are realizing now, all these CEOs, that we don't all want to be the same, because how do we actually grow our business? We need all those different perspectives. So it's kind of cool to be not only an Indigenous tour operator and giving some of this information and creating that movement in a positive way, because I call it kind of reconciliation action, for people to do more digging and to do more discovery. Because as we know with the government, they want to quickly, once they know they're in the wrong, give the money, get the settlement done, and let's move on. But we can't really reconcile if we don't really know the truth. And sadly, with our school system, we don't truly really know all the black eyes, right? And we need to really know that to really fully heal. Because there's a 7-generation teaching, and it's no different when you think, when I graduated from the U of L in 1996, right? That was when the last residential school closed. So that was the other thing. When I went to school, I had no idea about residential schools. I learned it in my 20s. But then it also grounds me like, holy crap, I can't believe the last residential school closed when I graduated from my first degree, right? And when you think of the other pillars of the Métis culture is the Red River cart, because when you think of the rich fur trade that took place, when we transitioned to an agricultural, agrarian type of lifestyle, and all of our relatives kind of moving west from Manitoba, like from the Red River settlement, well, it was the Red River carts that moved family and freight, right? Because it was all about being freighters and ferries, like cable car ferries and stuff that eventually evolved. And when you think, what a cool invention, because I love Lego, my kids love Lego, I still build with them. But to have a wooden vehicle, I call it the SUV of the Great Plains, because it's all made of wood, it's all interconnected. There's no metal, because again, metal was very hard to come by. There wasn't a blacksmith on every bend in the river, like how we have Home Depot on every corner, right, to get any kind of repair goods for our house. But when you think, anytime you needed a repair, there was always trees, right, to honor them and to harvest them in a respectful way and then fix it. And so you had a wagon that carried like 1,000 kilos, right? You also had shelter. And then when you came to a mighty river like the North Saskatchewan, you take the wheels off, you set them on top of each other with the bed of the wagon, and now you have a raft. And then for the other 6 months of the year, you get a dog sled team, take the wheels off, and now you have a dog sled. Yeah, and during the sacred buffalo hunts, you put them in a circle, and then you have basically not only your homestead, right, this kind of temporary homestead, but that protection and having rifle pits. So yeah, it's one of those things. And then of course, when you think of food and music, those are also key components. But it's the fiddle, right? When you think of jigging, right? It's that mash with like French dancing and Highland dancing like that. You can see that French and Scottish influence, the First Nations, right, with the chicken dance. Like there's a lot of mixing of culture to create a distinctive dance. And I will play like hopefully some music for you later. But the reason we stopped here for this is when you think of history hiding in plain sight, like the very first Fort Edmonton was built in 1795, where the Sturgeon River meets the mighty North Saskatchewan River downstream near Fort Saskatchewan. That was the very first one. Then the second one was literally downstream of here, closer, where the low-level bridge is. And then the third one, believe it or not, if you're familiar with Smoky Lake, it was over 100 kilometers away. And that fort didn't last long because, again, this being that sacred meeting place, you know, this is where the action is. So when you think of building these expensive forts, you wanted to go basically where people met to do the trade. So then the fourth one is basically where you see this distinctive, historic Rossdale power plant. And if you like Spider-Man or any kind of New York architecture, you can see the Art Deco, right? The white squares in the corners. The brickwork is like what you would see in many places in New York, right? Because I had an opportunity to go there, and it's such a beautiful place. But it just kind of reminds me of New York. But when you strip away what you see and you double that size, maybe half the height but double the footprint, that's where Fort Edmonton 4 was. So from 1813 to 1830. That's where Fort Edmonton 4 was. And where we're standing right here as we come off the North Saskatchewan, or off the Walterdale Bridge, this is where the Northwest Company Fort was. And if you know your history, in 1821 is when the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company merged. When the Hudson's Bay Company got its monopoly back. When it gobbled up, almost like a forced takeover. So when you think, here we are in a modern day, you know, part of the Commonwealth Walkway with modern benches, but this is that moment in time in 1821. We're also living it, like in this specific geographic location. And then Fort Edmonton 5 is basically south of where the legislature is, from 1813 to 1907. And then by 1915, you'll see in a storyboard when you go to the burial grounds, it was completely removed because it was a bit of an eyesore, right? The brand new high-level bridge at the time and the brand new legislature. So it's hard to believe, right? Like when you look around, see this modern landscape, a bit of an eyesore at the transformer yard, an old power plant, but all of that history, all those layers of occupation are beneath our feet. And one thing that's special is when I said when the Laurentide ice sheet basically gave the Cordilleran ice sheet one last hug and retreated for good across the Great Plains, when the animals return, something else important to share with you as a member of the River Valley Alliance is this is the only place in Turtle Island, as we know as North America, where 37 different species migrate through the greater Edmonton area. It's also called the Wolf Track. When you think of QA2, the highway, there's also that traditional knowledge of this migratory route from literally, you know, when you think of present-day Mexico to the north. And we are that migratory route. So when the animals return, no surprise the people return. And when people passed away, right nowadays, when you basically pay at a funeral home, right, you're in a 6-foot plot, or you get cremated. Seems to be the way, right? It's cheaper. But when you think back in the day, people were buried in a buffalo robe above ground, and then the animals would take them. And the oral history has like over 1,000 people buried here. So when you think east of the Rossdale power plant, beneath our feet, sadly underneath the transformer yard, underneath the roadways, the hill leading up to the legislature, this is all one large burial ground. And it's not the only one. That's another learning that I had about a year ago, that I thought this was the only one for this area, Amisquichy-Waskagan, but there's other burial grounds. This is just kind of that one that's more well known because it's also the Fort Edmonton Cemetery above it, and then also Alberta's first Catholic and Methodist cemeteries, because the very first church in all of Alberta was in, well, I would say, I'll correct myself, that there's still a historic church, the very first church that's still standing, a very old one by Métis Crossing. But when you think out of the 5 forts of Edmonton, the very first chapel was in Fort Edmonton 5 in 1853. And then they were buried here, right? Because many people think of the oldest cemetery as the one with the really old tombstones, right? These are almost like wooden crosses that have eroded, and now it's this little green space that we're going to go to next, right? And it's so important to really kind of peel the modern landscape and realize the spirits are with us. And this is the forebears of, as we know as today, as Edmonton. You know, they are residing there, and what better way to honor them with the smudge ceremony? Right, so welcome to the ancient sacred burial ground and the Fort Edmonton Cemetery. And you can see this is not a very large green space, because again, a lot of people that travel on the highway and park, you know, at a red light, they kind of realize that, oh, it must be kind of a green space or a park, but they don't realize the significance of it because, you know, kind of have a heavy heart. This is also the essence of why I created the River Valley Discovery Tour. Is literally I was standing here in March 2020 when the world shut down, right? Because I just finished reading the Philip Couture's book, which is Castles to Fort, and all the other research I did on the Commonwealth Walkway. And I was just kind of blown away that this hidden gem, very historic, very important, should be a UNESCO World Heritage Site already, right? It's basically so unknown to many people of Amiskwachee, Waskahigan, or as we know as Edmonton. And I really wanted to bring it to light because when I came here and there's still snow on the ground, there was a spear where we're smudging. You see that rock in the distance. The oral history has, or the legend, is that's an undisturbed grave and the last person, like, you know, buried in the veil of the night. Because you can see with the modern day road and the, you know, the transformer yard, so much of this land has been so disrupted, right? With the road alignments and so forth and the sewer, very little is still intact fully. But where we're smudging, that's actually an intact grave, right? And when you think of, you know, the light posts, they represent teepee poles. And have you noticed, like, the sky is being illuminated, not the ground, like when you think in your own residential neighborhood. It's like the spirits, like when you go to church and you want to remember someone, you light a candle. It's no different, right? Because here we are standing on Mother Earth. It's daylight hours, Father Sky, and the grandfather spirit lives in the trees, and the grandmother spirit lives in the rocks. So you can see you have all the elements in this really small, special place. And if you typically look around, there's 9 teepee poles, right? Typically there's 13, right, to represent the 13 full moons, right? Because Indigenous people go by the full moons, not the 12-month calendar that we're used to today. But you can see it's purposely broken. Likewise, the centerpiece, right? You can see it's a spear, a cross, right? Because again, it's holy ground, right? Because, you know, it's Alberta's first Catholic and Methodist cemetery. And then the compass, medicine wheel, so many things in the centerpiece. And if you look closely, the crushed limestone is also in the shape of the infinity symbol for the Métis, if you look, right? And then the monument with all the names are in the center. There's like over 240 names from the Hudson's Bay Company journals. And then again, when you think almost that homage to the last ice age, they have pink granite, like these stones that are in the perimeter of this actual sacred place. And it's also good to kind of recognize, like, when you modify a rock, when you think of a tombstone, or in this case, right, these sitting areas, right, these are stones, right, where that is a rock being kind of like a glacial drop stone that they basically utilize to mark that grave, where it's basically going to be our smudging altar for today. But again, in the distance, you see there's 7 very detailed storyboards with so much information that very few people walk there. So we want to highlight that too. So essentially what we're going to do to honor the oral history of over 1,000 individuals, right, the forebears of Edmonton, we're going to recognize, you know, the First Nations, because there's many different nations, right? It's not just Nehewaka Cree, there's Niitsitapi, Blackfoot, Blood, right? Kainai, they're here as well, like from all parts of Alberta. When it comes to First Nations, you'll see their names, as well as French names and Scottish names. So you can see it's something we can really learn from this. Like today, it seems like with all of the ins and outs of the world and a lot of conflict, it's almost like we're trying to find ways to, separate ourselves instead of learning from the past where everybody was together, right? So you can see even such a simple, small place like this, to humble yourself and to realize that, we really need to come together and not find ways on social media to pick each other apart. And you can see there's teachings with a place like this. And then at the end, we'll go to the storyboards and you can really see the journey of the history.
And when I'm in amongst the trees and the mountains all around, that is when I see that I'm so very small.
So this is a picture of Fort Edmonton 5 where they do, and again, it's sad, right? Because I don't know if you've been to the ledge grounds, there's only 3 markers. And that was the height of the fur trade from 1830 to 1907. Is literally, when you think of that white government building, it's almost like the Palisade walls. That's what it reminds me of when I look up, because when you think of all the different forts, like why did they move them? Well, when you think it took a lot of wood to build a fort. So they would deforest it, like an area, because you can see, look at all the trees gone to build the fort. And if there was ever a fire or a flood, then they have to rebuild. And they can't rebuild. And then, of course, they learned from that 1915 flood, like we look in a modern day, but in the past, right, all those 100-year floods, they kept moving higher elevations each time. So when you think from John Walter's home, looking out to the north, this is what Fort Edmonton 5 looked like. And like I said, there's the northwest marker, a northeast marker, and a blurb on John Rowland. That's it. Right? Elderly people that are part of their, or I guess retirees doing their lawn bowling league, are literally in the footprint of the fort. Yeah. And there's only those little markers, right? And it really gives an appreciation of, and again, when I think of forts, like 4 walls, but it's actually 6-walled fort. And again, a lot of people, because I volunteered at Fort Edmonton Park before I started Talking Rock Tours. A lot of people thought, just like when you think of Hollywood movies, they had to build forts to keep the savages out. But the reason they built the walls was to keep the bears and the wolves out. Because when you think, right, pemmican, actually you get to try it if you like, pemmican was the food stuff, right? There wasn't no 7-Eleven or Circle K on every corner back then, right? It was basically pounded up and cured with like bear fat as the food stuff of the fur trade, right? And along the North Saskatchewan River, like going from Fort Edmonton to Fort Garry, as we know as Winnipeg, Manitoba, there's still stashes where the pemmican is still edible. Oh, wow. Yeah, like wrapped in canvas and stuff like that. Yeah, and you get blueberries. This was just straight meat, but they can like add with fruits and stuff. And so when you think from here, 1871, this is what it looked like in 1912, and by 1915, because this was horse stables. So you can see brand new high-level bridge here, brand new legislature. Got to get rid of the eyesore. And sadly, it would have been cool if people had that forward thinking back then, because I know with the Berlin, the wall, when it came down, like they marked it now with flagstones.
Oh, yeah.
So when you think having the footprint, like when you think all the different forts, whether from Fort Saskatchewan or the ledge ground, to mark, like to delineate the Palisade walls. Yeah. And that's why they had the walls, was to keep the wildlife out. Because you imagine the smell of the meat.
Oh, that would
and all of the pelts, because the currency was the beaver pelts. So the smell of the rawhide, the meat, curing, drying, drew the attention. Right, and that's always a good point. And I'm glad Fort Edmonton still does that educational piece.
Yeah.
Because again, Hollywood, it's all about, you got to build forts to keep the savages out and keep the modern European lifestyle in. And then here's a cross section of the river valley. When I was saying about when you go to Lethbridge and you see that world's largest trestle bridge, you still get that here in Edmonton. It's just kind of hard to tell because there's multiple floodplains. And again, you don't want to build on the south side. right? When you think the north side gets the sun and the moisture basically evaporates on a constant rate, it's always those multi-million-dollar houses by Twilliger Park. It's when it's on the shaded side with that moisture and those slip plains, right?
Yeah.
And then, yeah, you get landslides. That's also going to be an item on the store eventually. It's going to be a lithics kit. So schools can buy them or other tour operators, and it's 11 stone tools, exact replicas of the priceless artifacts for Western Canada. So it's like holding history in your hands, because this is, that's what it is, Lifeways of Canada. That's the archaeological firm in Calgary. So why, when you go to the Royal Alberta Museum, you don't have this front and center as a plastic replica? Because this is the smoking gun about the 10,000 years of history hiding in plain sight. Because as a scientist and having that anthroarchy background as well, right? The facts are the facts, right? A spade is a spade. You got to share that. But that's what this image is. This stone knife was found 3 to 4 meters below the Mount Mazama ash layer. And on the full tour where we're at that outcrop with the glacial Lake Edmonton sediments, there's the Mount Mazama ash layer. It's about 2 centimeters thick. It's kind of a pinkish. Should have brought some. So you could hear, the actual volcanic shards in it. It's very abrasive. And you can see these storyboards are from 2005, so it's not fully representing the age now, because the geologic community has upped it to 7,700 years ago. So if you've ever wanted to go to Crater Lake, Oregon, just north of California, south of Oregon, that's where Mount Mazama used to stand, but now it's Crater Lake, Oregon. So when it blew its top 7,700 years ago, there was Indigenous people that lived in that area, and it covered about 20% of Turtle Island. And we have that ash layer in the river valley. And it's one of those powerful marker beds, right? Because if you have an artifact below it, like this Clovis spear point, because this was dated 13,000 years ago. So think, the dad at the time, right, when you think attach a broomstick to that, was hunting woolly mammoths and mastodons here in southern Alberta. Because that's why you look at the size of that spear point versus an arrowhead to hunt buffalo. Do you see how large the megafauna to the smaller fauna for hunting? So 13,000 years ago in southern Alberta, and then 800 years ago. In the last 200 years, a lot of them just use tin or metal, right? Because again, it takes a lot of effort and skillmanship to build stone tools, right?
Yeah.
Using a host rock and building a useful stone tool. But it goes to show you, if you found that artifact below that Mount Mazama ash layer, whether you're on a reserve or someone that's just hiking the river valley, you'd be able to tell the Royal Alberta Museum that it's older than 7,700 years ago, if you know it hasn't been disturbed. Likewise, if this one was above, which you know is 800, right, it would be younger than that 77. So you can see, by knowing that little bit of knowledge, when you're hiking in the North Saskatchewan River Basin, you can actually start dating artifacts that you would find, right? And it's quite powerful knowing that. But isn't it sad that this is probably in a drawer or shoebox in Calgary, when this is that smoking gun of evidence that was found 3 to 4 meters below a 7,700 year, a geologic event, right? And when you think, there's many schools named after Paul Kane, right? He was an employee of the Hudson's Bay Company, but he was an awesome painter. So again, no Polaroids, no Kodaks, no smartphones back then. So he painted. So when you look at that white government building, really looks like those 6 walls of Fort Edmonton 5. You really get that appreciation, because there's Fort Edmonton 5. Almost looks like the cliffs of Dover. You see where the high level bridge, or the Walterdale Bridge with the rapids, right? For that low point, right? To cross by foot or by horse. And then the cross, because wherever you planted the cross, being a holy place on top of the ancient burial ground. And then all of, when you think of Remax Ball Diamond, right, all of that was a Sundance ceremony area, and then became a rodeo ground. And you can see back in the day, that's where the teepee villages were. And you can see we lived in harmony back then, right? And when you think, when the Prime Minister, Wilfrid Laurier, made that announcement that Edmonton was going to be the capital city and Alberta was joining Confederation in 1905, that took place over there. So why isn't there a storyboard Like when you think there is, like when you go to the provincial archives, there's a photograph with grandstands with that big announcement, right? It's historic, right? In Canada, right? Like Alberta joining Confederation and being the capital city of Alberta. And when I look at that ball diamond, it reminds me of the grandstands of that imagery. But why isn't there a storyboard?
Yeah, something.
Right? Like that's where that announcement took place, that Alberta joining Confederation was right over there.
Yeah.
Right? And
I never
again,
knew that.
why isn't this at each entrance of the Royal Alberta Museum? This famous Paul Kane painting. But look where it is. It's at the Royal Ontario Museum. So do you see what I mean about a lot of museums are giving back like Egyptian artifacts to bring it home to the new museum there. So why aren't we doing that here in Canada? Why is this where people in Ontario enjoying instead of here in Alberta?
Yeah.
Especially, Edmonton.
Yeah.
And you can kind of see here's another imagery of the burial grounds, the cemetery in relation to Fort Edmonton 4 or 5. But I found it very powerful with all the storyboards, right? Because, when you think of how the Scottish people were treated by the English people and how a lot of them wanted a new life and they came this way, right? Because Bannock isn't native, wasn't created by First Nations people. We borrowed it from the Scottish.
Oh, I never knew that.
Yeah, so it's like fried bread, right? That's another gift from the Scottish culture showing, right? My favorite is fried bannock versus baked bannock, because anything fried is great, right?
True.
And when you think John Rowan, right, in Fort Edmonton Park, that's what he looks like. And his wife, because I forgot to point that out with Nancy, like being on this side of the monument. But yeah, his wife. And again, he was one of those well-respected, because he was the most influential white man in all of Western Canada back then at the height of the fur trade when he was the chief factor. But he was fair. So whether you're a horse thief, whether you're Indigenous or not, he gave out punishments the same. And also when you think a lot of these chief factors were not good men, right? When you think from, from being a family man, they had country wives, right? They had more than one wives. But with John Rowland, he truly loved like Nancy, and he was one of those, because my mother-in-law is from Scotland, so, right? I've never met a Scot that I never liked, just like I've never met a Brazilian I never liked, right, when I lived there for a year. And I just, it warms my heart when I see images of him, like, for having someone who was a legit, upstanding person back in that day, because it was like the Wild West.
Yeah.
Anything went. And isn't it sad to think there was country wives? And when you got posted out, a lot of them were kind of kicked to the side, right? Because a lot of them used Indigenous women to be that alliance. Like if you watch that Frontier program on Netflix with Jason Momoa, you saw a lot of shenanigans. I think there's a squirrel on that tree.
Yeah.
That's nice. He's blessing us. Oh, there he is, running to the next tree. But isn't that sad? Because a lot of them were using, just like in that program, they used each other to try to get promoted and to try to get a higher position of power. But then there was others that were marrying in so that they could be the trade partner. And when they got sent away or they wanted to go back to England, they just left their wife and children, like, see you later. And then they had to fend for themselves. And you can imagine being like that as a single mom with your children, right? Many of your First Nations cousins, right? You'd be like, oh, well, you're not a full First Nations, do you know what I mean? And there's probably animosity, and a lot of them were kind of left to fend for themselves, right? Some of them were obviously adopted back. But yeah, things like that, those untold stories, right? In some ways it's heartbreaking, and it's one of those things. Life isn't all about rainbows and unicorns.
Yeah.
And then to honor the Métis, right? When you think the last sacred buffalo hunts on horseback was in the 1860s, 1870s. So it was another famous Paul Kane painting that took place in 1846. Because isn't it crazy to think in one of our human generations, we went from estimates of 60 million plains bison, as we know as the buffalo in the traditional ways, because again, that's that legacy piece, right? Because again, buffalo only exists, like the water buffalo in Africa. But when Europeans came, right, to the New World as Turtle Island, and they saw the 60 million roaming plains bison, they just assumed they were buffalo. And that legacy still exists, because traditionally when we talk about the buffalo hunt, we're honoring that time before, when you think the scientific community, you got to like label everything properly, right? It's a plains bison and a woodland bison, right? A wood bison, you know what I mean? And when went from estimates of 60 million down to less than 1,000, like some as low as like 300, right? They're just with, Justin Brucehead's talk recently, just to know it went like that low.
That's crazy.
And from the 1870s on, like when you think here we are in modern day Edmonton, but back then, they didn't see buffalo anymore. So then when the government of Canada bought the herd from two half-breed men, right, two Métis, right, from Montana, and they thought they bought 400 head, it ended up being 800 head. And they used Elk Island as that staging area. And so that's why it's important to have that as that other discovery tour. Is it wasn't meant to be, right? It was local elk ranchers that got together that fenced that area to preserve the elk, because of course when the buffalo were gone, right, people needed food, so then they went after all the other large fauna, the other wildlife, to feed their families. So they wanted to protect the elk herd. But then because that was the only fenced area in Canada, when the government of Canada bought that herd from those Montana Métis men, they used it as a staging area for their new national park, which is sadly not in existence. It's like where CFB Wainwright is. Because it used to be Buffalo National Park. But because it wasn't fenced and it was interbreeding and the carrying capacity was reached and not enough food, sadly they perished. But the 30 that remained, that Edmontonians at the time fell in love with the buffalo again. And they're like, no, you can't take them all. You have to give us something for being that staging area. And they left 30, and now look, it's the breeding grounds for the world. And it's another agent of reconciliation and action, because, going to Justin's talk recently and how they're reintroducing the buffalo to the, the blood reserve for the Guyanai and the Piikani people, right? It's also all around the world. Like there's buffalo in Russia, Alaska, Yellowstone, Banff. It's all from Elk Island. So you can see why there's so much meaning to have that Elk Island Discovery Tour, because you get to go to a protected place, a boreal forest from 1906, where the buffalo still roam. So yeah, when you see an image like this, like wouldn't it have been amazing to have a time machine to go back in the 1850s to see all of this take place? Like how it was like this big community event, how a priest would be with them. So you would have weddings and baptisms, harvesting, everybody working together to literally feed everyone from one sacred buffalo hunt, and how you would migrate like your wintering camp, your summer camp, and just having that in your lifestyle.
Yeah.
And then, it was all taken away in one generation. And how now in 2024, we're seeing that revitalization with the buffalo roaming the Great Plains again, and like protecting the grasslands. Because really, when you think of it, the native grasslands of North America, that's what's really like less than 5% exists still. So as we reintroduce the buffalo back on the Great Plains, we really need to protect the native grasses as their important food supply. Because again, a lot of people forget about that, and all the other species at risk that go with the buffalo. Because as one elder shared, when it comes to the beaver and the buffalo, they're a four-legged ecosystem. Wherever they go, they bring life. Like they're not only just a keystone species, like they are a very powerful relations that bring life and heal the ecosystem, right? Because when you have beaver, you have wetlands. If you have wetlands, you don't have forest fires or grass fires.
Yeah.
So, and of course, with the buffalo roaming and all of the churning of the soil and how they modify the landscape, with their dung as well, it just brings life. And it's really powerful to see. And when I see an image from back in the day, right, in probably 50 years from now, there'll be this going on again with Indigenous nations on their reserve lands, like having their own buffalo hunts again. And then this one is kind of share, when you think of this, because you see the infinity symbol with the crushed limestone, the centerpiece, right, the broken circle, the broken teepee, right, with the teepee poles. But you can see this was supposed to be over there by the bridge. So it's none of those things like, write your counselor, because you can see we're over here. it was meant for here. So I don't know if they ran out of money or they're like, oh, who cares? Right? Someone will find this. But do you see, like, look at all the, like, when I saw this for the first time, I was like blown away on how much information is like gifted to the public right here. Like all of the research and all the work to make these beautiful storyboards, and very few people even know about it.
Yeah, as we said to you off camera, we didn't know that they were even here. And so, like, for other people who are watching, we'll have the location in the video so they can come take a look. We can't show them for copyrighted purposes, but you should definitely come check them out and read them all yourselves.
Little tiny part of this big beautiful world, and when you strip.
All right. So Bridget, we're part of the La Terre Geo Tour, like that second portion of my original envisionment of the River Valley Discovery Tour. So as part of that initial kind of medicine walk, being in the boreal forests in the heart of Edmonton, as we lead up to INIW, I Am the Earth, also River Lot 11, and the Indigenous Art Park. And I just wanted to kind of showcase again the Emisk, the beaver. You can see how many trees have been taken. But another medicine that's kind of hiding in plain sight, do you see the red willow?
Oh, yeah.
And then you see it also in the foreground, right? It's not the most abundant, but it's very distinctive. Because as you know, in Alberta, we're wild rose country,
Yes.
right? There's over 30 different species of wild rose. And for willow, there's over 70 different species. But the red willow itself, the bark of it, because when you think of anyone that's elderly that has like their 80 milligrams of aspirin, right, just in case, or for any kind of pain relief. So you can chew that bark if you get injured in the woods, or if you had time, you can make tea, and that's essentially where ASA came from.
Oh, really?
And when you also think of willow, right, it's very malleable like gold, right? Because whether you're plus 40 or minus 40, you can actually shape it and it doesn't snap. So when you think of making baskets, or when you think during the sacred buffalo hunts, right, they would use willow, especially the straight parts, right, to make arrows and then their bows. So you can see many uses. And as well, some nations use, various willows, including the red willow, for a sweat lodge. And again, for me, learning my Métis culture as well as my First Nation kind of cousins culture, wherever I go with my discovery tours, I always thought, especially me being, Roman Catholic, like 90% of, proud Métis are, I thought going to a sweat lodge was like the equivalent of going to church on Sunday, but living on the land in a good way is actually the church of the First Nations. You go to a sweat to heal, and you offer gifts depending on what kind of guidance or what type of healing. And there's 4 rounds, there's 28 ribs, and it's reflective of like going back to the womb, right? That healing place. It's also a portal. I don't want to share too much because it's one of those self-discoveries, right? To offer tobacco once you're invited, right? Because again, you always have to be proactive. If you really want to, experience it, right? You want to have an open heart and an open mind, and then do that proper protocol. And it's an amazing experience because I kind of, like my ancestors being the bridge for Indigenous and European cultures, I find that in spirituality now, right? There's many religions of the world. In my opinion, it's better to be spiritual than not. And what better way for me, even though I was brought up in the church, I really see the importance of, the Indigenous worldview and the Indigenous spirituality because, again, the mysteries of the world, there's so many, and what better way is to experience it in any fashion for all the different layers of our wellness, right, to live a good life. And yeah, it's always cool to see the workings of the Emisk, and again, medicine, right, because it's like tools, medicine, and spiritual, supplies that are just right here in a boreal forest. Yeah, another key component of a boreal forest is the paper birch tree. I don't know if you see it, how it's exfoliating, but again, something hiding in plain sight that has a lot of value, because when you think of a lot of Indigenous cultures, right, they had birch bark canoes, just like the voyageurs. And just like my Baba, who'd make me quilts with whatever she utilized, it's like selectively harvesting parts of the tree right, in a meaningful way, but also not to harm the tree, right? You're not going to just literally use one tree to make a tire canoe, right? You're going to selectively harvest it so that it's kind of that symbiotic relationship that you're not hurting it, but you're still utilizing it for something important, like a birch bark canoe. And when you think when the fur trade kind of fizzled out, and it was more of a like hunter and trapper type of lifestyle as we were kind of transitioning to that agricultural, society that we kind of still have today, you would still harvest like a panel. You can almost see like there's still remnants of a panel that was harvested on the straight part of the trunk, right? You'd harvest your panel, right, to create almost that rectangular sheet, and then also rotate it to make almost like a megaphone. And even to this day, like the Métis Nation, they have moose call competitions, right? By using the birch bark to have that megaphone to make, animal sounds to attract wildlife to hunt. And the other thing that kind of blew me away too is, we all know about maple syrup. You can't go to an airport anywhere in Canada that doesn't have maple syrup. But I was also quite shocked that, birch syrup is a thing. And especially in the Yukon, right? You can even go to like any grocery store and they'll have early, mid, and late season birch syrup. Cool. And it's so good. Like it's not as sweet as maple syrup. But when you think everything that's within this paper birch tree gives life, because think if you're lost in the woods and you need, that pick-me-up, right? You can basically tap the tree and have, obviously it won't be as sweet as what you get in the store today, but you'd have almost the electrolytes. Like think of a nature's Gatorade. That's so right? Cool. And again, something just like a regular tree, but again, if you look around, it's not very abundant, right? Because of the growing conditions. Mm-hmm. And another one, it's something that wasn't First Nation, who originated, but chaga. I'm not sure you've heard of that medicine. Chaga grows on birch trees. And again, it's like this fungus that grows on birch trees, but it can also help cure many ailments, including cancer. Oh, wow. Right, and it was something that Europeans, like from Russia, that was some gifts that kind of came across the pond, right, across the Atlantic. How you can see, especially in a global world that we live in today, how we learn from each other, right? Medicines of the world. Because when people talk about chaga, they think, well, it's a medicine the Indigenous people must have created like bannock. But no, bannock was introduced, just like chaga was introduced. But it grows on birch trees. And you think, if one of your family members was suffering from, especially if you live a traditional way of life, do you want to go through all the rounds of chemotherapy? Or would you want to have, tea made from chaga by someone who's knowledgeable in medicines? Right? I think I would want to go the natural way before resorting to killing everything in my body to rebuild it. Yeah. So when you think something, and again, I love onions, because who doesn't like onion rings? Like you think of the exfoliating of the tree, right? It's like an art form as well. Yeah. I never especially when you look up, like how it's peeling in the wind. Yeah. So it's almost like anytime you see a birch tree, right? Like give a tree a hug, right? Yeah. Like when you think, right, the grandfather spirit lives in the trees. So Bridget, you can see, here we have a beautiful piece of granite from the last ice age. And now it's been modified to kind of highlight what this traditional place is, right? With INIW, right? Which is Nehewak Cree, meaning I am of the earth. So really, when you think since time immemorial to honor Mother Earth, this land, right? Almost before Amiskwachee, Waskahigan, Treaty 6 territory, and now, as we know, is Edmonton. So you can see having that foundational title for this place. And also to highlight, here we have a rock, but as soon as you modify it, now it's a stone, which of course leads to that contemporary component of this La Terre Geotour, which is the Indigenous Art Park. Right, and it's hard to imagine, right, because here we have a modern day parking lot with these beautiful art installations. But again, people forget, right, a prominent Métis family, right, Joseph McDonald and his family lived here for 34 years. So you kind of have that sandwich of occupation. You have INIW, right, a proud Métis river lot, right, with Joseph McDonald, and then on top being the Indigenous Art Park that we're about to see. for me, I live in Northeast Edmonton, so I always get great joy, again, with sharing my knowledge and having that connection to the past and present. As I drive across the high-level bridge, that kind of modern-day connection to the past, right? Because you see this old, crusty, kind of rusty bridge. And then I leave on the Walterdale Bridge back home. So again, being on both fords of the river, right? Having that connection with our journey, where we started, you know, these anchor attractions that I like to call them, but like the essence of our, you know, 10,000 years of history lesson here in Edmonton's River Valley, right? Which is also North America's largest green space, right?
Yeah, and I just, like, the fact that we only started over there and just the amount of knowledge I feel like I've attained over our time together is crazy, because no offense to school, but school did not set me up for success in this regard, because I never knew any of this was in our city. So thank you so much for like opening our eyes and sharing all that you know with us, because this has been so amazing.
Yeah, and it's an honor to share it, because whether it's doing online research or books or elders, by giving protocol, you can see it's a journey in itself, right? And every year, whatever I learn that's new, I incorporate it in the following year. So you can see it's not a cookie cutter experience. It's like a living, breathing experience, right? And it's almost like people should come to almost like refresh, especially with families, like almost every 2 to 5 years. Like, what has Keith added? What are we doing differently? Right? And the other thing too is I don't want to always be the sage on the stage 100% of the time, because I've had people that have PhDs in geology that share knowledge, because that's what I encourage, right? Like, it's also that continuous sharing, because I've had botanists in Elk Island National Park where I don't know the names, whether it's the Latin names, do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
It's like eye-opening for me, where someone kind of takes the mic, so to speak, and leads the group, and to be like, well, this is what I know.
Yeah.
And again, it was a huge honor, like I was saying, you know, as we were kind of getting ready on the tour, is like having Indigenous people, you know, on tour, especially the retirees and the elderly, right, from the Edmonton Aboriginal Senior Center, was very eye-opening, because I just assumed they all knew more than me. But sadly, with that legacy, that intergenerational trauma, it was like half and half. It was like half of them were like me teaching my children for the first time about this or that, and the others were leading, you know, the smudge and seeing, you know, spiritual things while we were together, right? It was very powerful.
That must have been a really empowering experience.
Yeah, it was, right? And it's one of those things, you know, some people believe we had a guardian angel in that specific time. It was like, you have 3 ancestors behind you, right? 2 on your left, 1 on your right. And it was just like, you know, it brought tears to me, because it was like, wow, I could feel it, but I just didn't know. And when other people can sense auras or spirits, right? Because not all the audience that are watching really understand it, right? You really have to have an open mind. And,
Absolutely.
and once you open yourself and you're vulnerable, you really take in more than just what the internet or, you know, textbooks tell you.
And I think this experience too, walking the walk, like how you were discussing before, if we're not on scooters or bikes or anything like that, like you were walking the earth and you were feeling the energies of the different spots, and you're opening your mind and learning things that you didn't know. And it's okay that you didn't know. Like, for me, it's been so much learning, because I didn't know anything, and I am okay admitting that.
Exactly.
You know, in order to grow and carry this knowledge with me moving forward.
And like any meaningful journey, it always starts with the first step in the right direction. And it's like coming with an open heart, because, you know, you want to stay away from the people that say they know everything, right? You need to start somewhere. And it's like, don't wait for tomorrow. You need to begin today.
Hey everyone, we just finished up at the tour. How did it go?
Went really well. Learned a lot. I hope that Edmonton and Alberta takes the steps to proper recognize Indigenous people and the lands, and giving them the rights, even just as a small thing as having a sign for where burial grounds are should be important enough to include.
Yeah.
Especially considering the size of like the Queen Elizabeth Park sign versus when we went to the the traditional burial grounds, that sign, and it was like
Yeah.
facing in. It was crazy, very eye-opening to what we have here in Edmonton. I tried a lot of new things today. We did a smudging ceremony. Y'all didn't get to see it because it's a sacred ceremony that you don't videotape, or at least we didn't videotape. And also the gift offering of the tobacco was really cool
that was
and
really
exciting. So that was really fun. I'm really grateful for the experience. Really opened my eyes and learned a lot about Edmonton. So it was really cool.
Yeah.
Rochelle?
Yeah, I loved it. It was great. I learned a lot. It was a beautiful day to do so, honestly. Like, we picked such a good day. A lot of walking. Yeah, it was great. It was great. I think it's definitely something that every Edmontonian should know the history of.
Or even including it in our school system, something like that, field trip wise.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah, so check out Talking Rock Tours. If you live in Edmonton, if you don't live in Edmonton, and let me just tell you, if you do live in Edmonton, my thought is like, why would I take a tour in Edmonton? I live in Edmonton. I learned a whole bunch.
Yep.
Edmonton has a lot more to offer than maybe you think it does. So
They also offer tours in Elk Island as well.
So put yourself out there. Try something new.
Do it.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Of the past, I'll return to us in need.